Okay, so we're going to quickly finish what you have left on your notes. So you should be on page 2, where it says long-term negative impacts next to the connect the dots. So we've previously talked about what happened immediately afterwards, short-term stuff, things like that. Now we're going to look at the long-term impacts of this Reconstruction era. So what you need to basically know is, starting with sharecropping, which we talked about before, remember the vast majority of slaves go right back to either their previous slave masters as well as neighboring slave masters. It creates an endless cycle of poverty and debt for those slaves. Then we have the two terms which I would bracket scalawags and carpetbaggers and know the difference between the two. So we're going to start with scalawags. So scalawags are people that in the South begins to kind of form out of the economic downturn of the South. Basically, it's several different Republicans in the South who start to support the Northern Republicans, and most of that is for their own benefit. So, for example, giving more rights to slaves allows them the opportunity to get more power in those different areas. Scalawags and carpetbaggers are both seen as negatives between the two, in particular scalawags, who are deemed kind of as the traitors of the South. And then heading into what is known as a carpetbagger. So a carpetbagger is going to be somebody who goes to the South from the North following the Civil War. And the reason they're called these carpetbaggers is because if you have ever seen Mary Poppins, you know that a carpet bag is basically like a small travel bag. You can be able to put different things in. So Mary Poppins bag is considered a carpet bag. And basically these are people that are going to move to the South, but specifically for monetary gain. So, for example, taking advantage of former slaves in the South. So, for instance, let's say that former slave wants to buy a piece of land. You have a piece of land that you have, but they're illiterate, so you're going to make it 4 times more expensive than it's actually worth, for example. So, both of these are controversial figures. Again, scalawags, I would make sure you highlight Southern white Republicans. And then for carpetbaggers, I would start the second bullet where they were specifically out to get monetary gain. So these are common ones that you could possibly see on the AP exam. You can see that you have the strong government coming in as the carpetbagger on the left-hand side, and the weak government is the traditional plower of the South. So in terms of KKK, which is next on your notes, we've already talked about that before. Most important thing to know about that, it comes out of those radical Republicans, that restrictions, and basically wanting to push out from that. And it's mostly leaders of the former Confederacy. Black churches is another positive. So you might see on the AP exam positives and negatives of Reconstruction. This is a positive one, which is going to create black churches and allows you to be able to freely be able to work. Now, there's 3 major sections of Reconstruction. You will need to know the difference between each of these. Reconstruction as a whole is bringing back the southern states back into the Union. Many people fought to preserve the Union, not necessarily slavery. So each of these different periods are different attempts to be able to bring the country back together. So we're going to start with Andrew Johnson, that's a typo on there. So that's Johnson, not Jackson. Anyways, Andrew Johnson is going to become the president immediately following Abraham Lincoln's death. He was his vice president. Now, remember how we talked about before how the vice president was typically the second placer and sometimes the opposite? That was kind of Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson in presidential Reconstruction basically wanted immediate bringing back of the Confederate nations, or the Confederate States. So he really advocated for immediate redemption or immediate Reconstruction and not allowing this to linger. So basically he attempted to return all rights to the former Confederate States after Lincoln's death. Now in terms of Andrew Johnson, this is where you can see this is the rail splitter. He's trying to bring the country back together during that Reconstruction era. Now in terms of some positives, so we're on page 3 of your notes. In terms of some positives about, and again, I don't know why I put Andrew Jackson. It's supposed to say Andrew Johnson on there, not Andrew Jackson. Silly me. But anyway, so a positive of Andrew Johnson's presidency is they do establish the Freedmen's Bureau. So the Freedmen's Bureau is basically the way to, if you want to highlight, provide social, education, and economic services, as well as advice and protection to former slaves. Basically, this was the organization by the government to help those former slaves. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau is considered both a huge positive as well as a negative. While the Freedmen's Bureau did give a lot of rights, it obviously didn't give all equal rights to different people. Now, you can see this is one's a negative portrayal of the Freedmen's Bureau, basically saying this is a massive expense of the white Congress and a waste of time. But think of it as basically a minority rights group from the government attempting to make sure that rights are being upheld. Now, in terms of other things that Andrew Johnson did as well. So the 13th Amendment, which if you look at that chart below on the same page, the 13th Amendment banned slavery and indentured servitude. And that's basically where Andrew Johnson stopped. While the Freedmen's Bureau was created, it didn't really advocate for massive amounts of rights except for the Confederacy. So, for example, letting Confederate states come back with no issues. You can see that we talked about this before. He didn't really care about the political rights. He gave those full amnesty and pardon, which we talked about before. And he restored all the land taken away by the Union Army. So if you want to bracket all this and put pro-South, Andrew Johnson, while he was Lincoln's vice president, does help the South pretty expensively. And he's a huge supporter of states' rights. Now, during this area, as well as presidential Reconstruction, it also begins what is known as the Black Codes. Make sure you star this term. Black codes were basically codes that were created that legalized slavery. So you guys should have on your assignment for homework during your Reconstruction simulation where you saw several different ones of these black codes. Each of the different black codes were all codes that banned things. So, for example, you cannot marry somebody who is white. You cannot be buried in the same cemetery as somebody who's white. Later on, these are going to be called something different, but basically this begins to question who has more power over the slaves. And what should happen to the former slaves? Is it the federal government or the state government? And the biggest opposition to this, if you want to highlight, is the Republican Party, because the Republican Party's in the North. They don't want these restrictions in the South. So heading into our second one, this is called Congressional or Radical Reconstruction. So presidential Reconstruction, you could summarize that as helping the South come back in. Freedmen's Bureau gets created, but nothing more really for African Americans. Radical Reconstruction is the opposite. This is going to be the heavy use of radical Republicans to give equal rights to former slaves. Now, they proposed something known as the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This would basically give African Americans a massive amount of civil rights following the Civil War. Now, this was immediately vetoed by Johnson. So if you want to highlight, it was vetoed by Johnson. This Civil Rights Act, by the way, does not come out officially for about 100 years until we start to have more Civil Rights Act in the 1860s Civil Rights Movement. But so an act that basically was supposed to give a ton of rights to people didn't. Basically, what did happen in Radical Reconstruction, though, was the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendment. So next to the 13th Amendment, you could put that was during the Civil War. It was actually in the second to last year of the Civil War. The 14th and 15th Amendment is during this time. So like we talked about before, 13th Amendment bans slavery. 14th Amendment makes former slaves all and anybody born in the United States citizens. And the 15th Amendment grants people the right to vote on the basis of race, not including women. So Congressional Reconstruction is, Congressional Reconstruction has two different sides. Basically, do you support complete abolition of slavery or do you protect states' rights? Now, Johnson, the president, is going to be on the opposite. So while Radical Reconstructionists wanted complete restriction of the South, Johnson believed in states' rights and supported the South in this, and he's going to veto almost everything. So you got to make sure that when you know Johnson, you know that it immediately should be having to do with the veto. So what should happen with the veto? Well, Andrew Johnson was upset about some treatment going on in the South. He felt like the military rule, bayonet rule, was not going well. And so he attempts to kick out and veto a new person coming in, instead putting in his own person in. Now, because of this impeaches Johnson. So basically, he violated an act. It passed through the House of Representatives. However, it lost in the Senate. So while he was impeached in the House, he was not confirmed by the Senate because of all these vetoes that he was doing. Now, Ulysses S. Grant is going to become the next president. Now, Grant, as you know, is going to be a Union general. He is going to lead by what is known as the waving the bloody shirt. That's like his political tactic, which basically means that any time that the Democrats are going to say that they should do something different, he waves his bloody shirt. He actually had a bloody shirt from the Civil War and said, I was there, I know why we fought this war, and we need to give more rights to people in the South. Now, basically, this is a political tactic used by the Republicans that any time the Democrats wanted something different, he says, don't forget what the Democrats did. Don't forget that we went to war for this. Now, Grant's presidency mostly revolves around wanting to destroy the KKK and supporting radical Reconstruction, as well as enforcing the protection of African Americans. Now, In terms of Grant, he's not necessarily successful. Obviously, the KKK goes slightly down during this period, but he doesn't really get what he's expecting out of this election of being able to succeed. Now, what he does end up succeeding, though, is that he is going to attempt to lessen the KKK, but Rutherford B. Hayes, the next president, is going to be the one that's going to be our biggest impact. Now, this election, if you will double star this, it's very important to remember, this election turns the tide. So if you want to draw a line above this election, everything before this is an attempt, for the most part, to get African Americans more right. It changes at the presidential election. So basically what happens is that Rutherford B. Hayes is going to run for the presidency. However, he himself, who was going against other people, results in a split. Basically, nobody had enough votes to be able to win the Electoral College. And because of that, now there's going to be an issue of who becomes the president. Now, basically, several different states had their counts discredited. Several people said that there was bribery involved. Basically, what you need to know on your notes is that a congressional commission is going to decide that Rutherford B. Hayes gets elected. Now, you can see that on your paper. It's highlighted, which I forgot to change. My fault. I wrote this wrong last year. If you will change where it says the House of Representatives and change that to Congressional Commission. Basically, the Congressional Commission comes to a compromise. And this is one of the worst compromises in terms of political scandal, in my opinion, in American history. Basically, the agreement is going to say that Rutherford B. Hayes becomes the president if they pull all those bayonet rule troops from the South protecting the African Americans. So you elect me as president, and I will take away all of the people in the South. So this ensures that a Republican gets voted in, but the Democrats get all of those people from the South. Basically, what you need to know is starring and highlighting that last bullet. This basically ends Reconstruction. Reconstruction ends because now there's not anybody protecting the former slaves in the South, and now the South can begin to do what they want. And this begins the period of redemption. Now, basically what this redemption is it's basically an attempt to redeem the South. So if you'll star that first bullet where it says the Redeemers are basically this democratic group in the South who now are going to attempt to redeem their states from the terribleness of the North. Basically, if you want to write a bullet next to this or a little arrow, this is the South trying to become what it was before. Now, this period of redemption, what you need to know is this is after Reconstruction. And this also, if you want to put next to this, is the return of the South to what they were prior to the war. So basically, Rutherford B. Hayes takes all of these people from the South from the bayonet rule. Because he has withdrawn federal troops, which if you see that's the second bullet of redemption period that I would star, this basically gives back all power to the white slave-holding families in the South. And this is what's known as the Jim Crow segregation laws. If you want to put that the HC, the historical context of Jim Crow, are the black coats that get created. Give me 1 minute, and I'm almost done. I'm on like the third to last slide. I'll come see you in your room. I'll be there in like 5 minutes. My apologies. So, basically, the black codes become Jim Crow segregation laws. And this is what you guys know as like the colored waiting rooms, the segregated different things and factory work and workers' rights and things like that. Anything that happens in terms of segregation is because of Jim Crow segregation. This is a highlighted and starred term. Basically, this begins with this idea of the Jim Crow South and the black codes and different things like that of restrictions that are going to occur. So this is what's referred to as the New South, which basically what you need to know is that the New South brings back, if you see in that second line, if you will basically highlight, embrace the values of thrift, industry, and progress. The New South basically represents a reversion back to pre-Civil War, but now they're going to be industrialized. So Southern industry expands dramatically, but agriculture is also going to remain the economic force. The next to Jim Crow segregation, you should also write down the word lost cause. And this is also just in general what the idea of the redemption period is. The lost cause is basically sympathy to the South for fighting in the war. So when we've talked about in the past about people saying, like, for example, the War of Northern Aggression. That's a very lost cause belief. Lost cause is anything that basically says that the beautiful cause of the South to fight in the war was lost, but that really we should be sympathetic to the South. And so it's really Southerners being sympathetic to their own plights and saying that they should have fought in this war. What they did was justified, just like Jefferson Davis, like we talked about before when we gave that example. So 2 examples of ways that they're going to discriminate. One is going to be what's called a poll tax, and you need to bracket both of these. Poll taxes were basically taxes that were levied that said that if you wanted to vote, you had to pay a tax. This especially disenfranchises or takes away the right to vote for people who are black, because traditionally they are more impoverished, can't pay the poll tax, and therefore can't be able to vote. Additionally, there was these things called literacy tests, which we'll talk about more when we get to the 1960s. But literacy tests basically said that you had to pass a test showing that you could read, write, and vote, or to be able to vote. The problem is very few people could pass these tests, and therefore during Reconstruction, really only about maybe 5% of African Americans to 9% actually were able to vote. And that's all you need to know. Maybe? Yeah, we already talked about that stuff. Okay, bye.